and welcome to Zoning 101. This is a session that's intended to provide a base level of information for city stakeholders who are interested in the city's zoning ordinance rewrite, which is a major effort that is coming up over the next couple of years. Some folks may have a good understanding of zoning and some may not, so we thought it would be a good idea to provide that level of information for anyone who wants to participate. So the city is going to be rewriting its laws that apply to zoning and land use. But what does that mean for you as a property owner, as a business owner, as a stakeholder of the city of Rockville? But just to back up a little bit, zoning is rooted really in the comprehensive plan. And some of you may have participated in the comprehensive plan process over the past several years that culminated in the mayor and council adopting the plan in 2021. What the comprehensive plan does is establish a vision for the future of the city of Rockville, and in this term it is for what should Rockville be in the year 2040. So it's the Rockville 2040 plan. What a comprehensive plan typically does at a very basic level is establish a series of goals, policies, and objectives that form the basis for land use regulation. But it's not just that. It's much more than that. And if you read our comprehensive plan, which incidentally is an award-winning plan from the National Capital Chapter of the American Planning Association, you know that it is very comprehensive in terms of what the vision and what the expectations are for the city as we move toward 2040. Also, a major component of the comprehensive plan is not only text and graphics and maps, but the proposed land use map. In Maryland, when you are establishing zoning, your zoning map should be very closely aligned with your land use map. So the comprehensive plan afforded the opportunity for everyone to weigh in on what the proposed land uses should be in the city. And the entire city, every parcel was looked at, but not every land use changed. You will probably notice, if you followed the process, that some of the proposed land uses will change from what had previously existed. And that's another reason why the city is looking at rewriting its zoning ordinance and correspondingly the zoning map. In Maryland, the state requires 12 visions be incorporated in the comprehensive plan, and the Rockville 2040 plan does that. And this leads to the topic elements of the zoning that the city will look to implement. Included among those are elements of quality of life and sustainability, public participation, identifying growth areas, community design, certainly infrastructure and transportation, as well as housing, economic development, and environmental protection. And last but certainly not least is implementation, how the comprehensive plan is to be implemented. How do we make it come alive? So one of those aspects, or one of those ways of implementation, is the zoning map. And the comprehensive plan land use map forms the basis for the zoning map. As I noted, every parcel was identified for a potential land use in the comprehensive plan. And now to have our regulations and our map agree with the comprehensive plan, we need to update the zoning and the zoning that applies to each and every parcel via the map. So you may ask, well, what really is zoning? At its very basic element, it's the most common tool that's used to regulate the use of land. Each property has a zone assigned to it, but what that really means for each property is it specifies what types of land uses are permitted on that property based on the zone that's assigned, what standards apply to those uses in terms of not only the uses themselves, but to the buildings and the sites that are located on a particular property. And it also sets forth procedures on how development occurs on properties. Of course, the zoning laws incorporate much more than that, but those are the very basic elements of a zoning ordinance, which of course is the text and the law that applies to zoning. And the zoning map is part and parcel to the zoning text. So you really need both of those things to affect changes in zoning. Our current zoning ordinance became effective in March 2009 after a comprehensive rewrite process and made some major changes to our zoning ordinance. One of the things that is, I believe, going to be carried forward in the new zoning ordinance is the basic zone categories that the city has. The comprehensive plan really did not recommend a major overhaul in the types of zones that we have, but certainly did recommend changes in the scale of certain types of development and the locations of those development. So our basic zone categories are residential, and by residential we mean single-family detached residential. Many of our neighborhoods are zoned residential, and you may have heard the term R60 or R90 thrown about, and what that refers to is the residential zone that is on the properties. Most of the eastern portion of the city in Lincoln Park, East Rockville, and the Twin Brook neighborhoods are zoned R60. Much of the West End is also zoned R60, as well as the Hungerford neighborhood. That's kind of the mainstay of zones that have, the residential zones at least, that's been in effect for a number of decades. But there's certainly other R zones that are in other parts of the city, and it really deals with the scale of development for each of those neighborhoods. The next category that's prevalent is the residential medium density category, or RMD. You may have heard someone say, well, that apartment complex is zoned RMD 25. And what that means is it's a residential medium density zone, allows for townhouse development as well as multifamily development in that zone. And if there's a number assigned to it, that's the maximum density in terms of units per acre that can occur on that property. The city also has 2 industrial zones. Only one of them are currently mapped. If you think of the areas off of East Goody Drive, those are the city's primary industrial areas. And of course, they have the I category. The other major category in the city is mixed-use zones. And this was something new in the 2009 code, but allowed for what we term mixed-use development to occur in many of our areas that previously only allowed single-use development, whether it be office buildings or retail. So mixed use is allowed to create the type of communities that are desired in the city in terms of the town center, on Rockville Pike, and it really is kind of the way that zoning is going trend-wise throughout the country, where we allow for retail, residential, office, and all of those types of uses that can be commingled in creating a more complete community or node within a community. And it's particularly useful when transit is prevalent or accessible. Another major zoning category are planned developments in the city. The city has a long history of the use of planned developments. We're actually pioneers back in the 1960s, and those have carried through in our zoning scheme over the years. And so if you think of neighborhoods like Newmark Commons all the way up through King Farm and Falls Grove, that those communities were planned and developed and built comprehensively based on each individual development approval, as opposed to being subject to the base zoning requirements. So that's a little bit of a twist on zoning. As I stated, the zoning text and the zoning map are critical to get the complete picture. This is the Rockville zoning map on the left on this slide. You notice it's probably somewhat similar to the land use plan, but not exactly if you really looked at it closely. And that's because a land use category that's in the comprehensive plan may be more broad or not get into density recommendations that the zone, which can be much more specific, can do. So there may be one or more zones that apply to a certain type of land use category in the comprehensive plan. On the right side of this slide is a more detailed zoning map. This happens to be the southern part of the town center, and it just kind of illustrates a little more clearly what we're talking about when we mean zoning maps. All the different zones are labeled. You can see the orange area on the right, that's the East Rockville neighborhood. They're zoned R60. As you get closer into the town center, you see MXTD, and that's a mixed-use zone, a transit district. That's where very high density is permitted adjacent to the Rockville Metro Station. You see a little bit of the purples, and those are the planned developments that I mentioned earlier. So we've got kind of a nice variety of the different zone categories in the city just right in this area. So we've seen the map. The current zoning ordinance also includes much more than just kind of the very basic elements of zoning. It does have those in the form of a table of uses. In other words, each zone has a list of uses that are either permitted, not permitted, permitted by special exception, which requires an approval by the Board of Appeals, or by conditional use, which there are conditions that apply to that particular use, and if the conditions are met, then that use can be either constructed or it can occupy an existing space. That's kind of very basic element of zoning in Rockville. Accompanying the table of uses are tables of development standards, and that's where we get at the real nature of the development. Start to look at densities, how much development can be built on a certain property. So that's where the regulations for building height, for building setbacks, for open space, and many other aspects that go into developing or designing really a site within the city. So those are kind of the basic standards within the zoning ordinance that every development and every property must comply with. Zoning is much more than that, and it also includes text on development review procedures. And what development review is how developments come forward and receive their initial approvals from the city. Some of you may be familiar with site plan process or have attended a planning commission meeting or a Board of Appeals meeting, which you were noticed and came out to testify. The development review process is when the city looks at all of its codes that apply to development, makes a recommendation, and brings it forward to the appropriate approving authority as kind of the first level of approval and a first assurance that it meets not only the findings that are required, but also the conditions of approval. And once that is met, then the development can move forward to the next phase, which is the building construction and engineering phase. Those are all covered by separate codes and not part of the zoning ordinance. The zoning ordinance does include aspects related to historic preservation, because in Maryland, historic preservation is an aspect of zoning, and that is the way it's been implemented here in the city is we've established what's called an overlay zone for historic preservation. So as we now know, every property in the city has a zone that applies to it. What the historic preservation overlay zone does is basically overlay or add kind of a second layer of zoning to a property that's within the historic district. In Rockville, what that really means is that the Historic District Commission has to approve any changes that would be proposed to properties that are in the district. There are other aspects to zoning, including parking requirements, and not only how many parking spaces are required on a property, but all the dimensions associated with them, and when walkways are required, when bicycle parking is required, and how many bike spaces are required. There's also landscaping requirements. The way it's working now, we have a landscaping manual that's referred to from the zoning ordinance that gets into specifics in terms of landscaping, but landscaping design is certainly part and parcel of any new development, so those are part of the zoning ordinance. You may have heard the term adequate public facilities. The city does have an adequate public facilities ordinance, and there are 4 tests that we term it APF, tests for when new development is coming forward. 1 is whether there's adequate school capacity. 2 is whether there's actual or adequate sewer capacity, actual water capacity, and whether the transportation system is sufficient to handle the new development that's coming. And that is road capacity, pedestrian capacity, and transit facility capacity as well. One aspect of zoning that's not discussed a lot, but certainly is important, is subdivision. And this is how lots are created in the city through the subdivision ordinance and the approvals by the Planning Commission. That's all spelled out in the zoning ordinance. And last but certainly not least, definitions are spelled out in the zoning ordinance as well. So the better definitions that are in your code, the better ordinance that you have. So that's kind of where we are right now. As I said, we're about to embark on a zoning ordinance rewrite, and we're terming that the ZOR. And it is a direct result of the city having adopted the Rockville 2040 Comprehensive Plan. And to that plan's credit, there is a whole series of recommendations for implementation of the plan and changes of zoning for certain properties, as well as changes to the zoning text itself. So it's a major implementation step to ensure that our plan is implemented. To that end, the city, in consultation with the mayor, city staff in consultation with the mayor and council, developed a project charter, which ultimately was endorsed by the mayor and council, and that is the roadmap for how the ZOR process is going to occur. I will say that the city will be embarking on the process with the help of a consultant team, and right now that request for proposals is on the street, and we hope to get a very good consultant team on board to help us produce the best zoning ordinance that we can. But the charter is an important step in that it kind of outlines the process moving forward, stating why we are updating the zoning ordinance and what are all the various components of the process. We know that there's going to be an extensive public participation process with roles for any stakeholder who wants to participate, and that'll be very important as we move forward. One of the great successes of the comprehensive plan was that it did have a significant public process, and we want to make sure that the comparable zoning ordinance, that we get it right, and that our stakeholders can have a review of that and make sure that we're getting it right as we move forward with changing our laws. So the purpose of the zoning ordinance rewrite, again, to implement many of the recommended actions in the comprehensive plan, but also incorporates a number of other aspects, and that includes accomplishing another initiative that was begun by the mayor and council, known as FAST, faster, accountable, smarter, and transparent. And this had the city looking at how we can improve our development review and permitting processes so that they are faster, just like it says, faster, more accountable, that the appropriate reviews are done, and that our processes are much improved. Other reasons for moving forward with the zoning ordinance rewrite are to incorporate best practices in planning and zoning. We know other communities are continually updating their planning and zoning processes, and we can certainly learn from them and from the consultant team that we bring on board. Many communities are addressing the same issues that we are. We want to be able to create a modern zoning ordinance that accommodates the updated current, living, working, and lifestyles that we are seeing. If you think about the last time that the zoning ordinance was rewritten just 15 years ago, how much things have changed since then, and we want to make sure that our code brings us forward into 2040. And we also want to create a user-friendly, accessible, and well-organized document that provides appropriate graphics and information links to continue to aid its understanding of zoning. Because we want to make sure that all of our stakeholders can access the code and have a good understanding of it. So there will be significant involvement through a number of stakeholders in the zoning ordinance rewrite, starting with the mayor and council, and including our planning commission and other boards and commissions, including the Transportation Commission and the Commission on the Environment. The city staff will be the project manager and making decisions on the process as we move forward, aided by the consultant team and guided by, of course, our stakeholders as well. We know that there will be a community outreach engagement strategy. We haven't specified what that will be until we do bring the consultant team on board and get their take on it. But we know that there will at least need to be kickoff meetings to inform all the public and stakeholders about the process that's coming up. And one thing about the drafting of the zoning ordinance rewrite through the charter is that we know that there will be kind of initial draft of the zoning ordinance earlier in the process, so that basically folks have something to review as we're moving forward. The comprehensive plan kind of established the policy guidance and the vision, so now we're looking at whether we've got the details down. And so I think it's important to have those details able to be reviewed earlier in the process. We want to make sure that stakeholders are able to be met where they are and where they can provide the best feedback. And the city has a number of things at their disposal to do that, including Engage Rockville and the city's website. We also want to ensure that the draft ordinance that comes forward to the mayor and council and planning commission for review reflects all the input that we engage. So the process we expect to take about 18 to 24 months from commencement and bringing the consultant team on board. So it'll be an ambitious process, given the amount of public involvement that we expect and certainly desire. Another reason why we're bringing the consultant team on board. So there will be a detailed schedule developed once they are retained, and we want to make sure that those project deadlines are met. Comprehensive plan was adopted in 2021, so we don't want to get too far separated from that adoption to make sure that we're implementing the plan. But we also recognize that in reality there may be some modifications necessary mid-process. We'll hope to avoid those. We know that there are certain aspects of the city code that will need to be modified along with the zoning ordinance, such as the forest and tree preservation ordinance, moderately priced housing chapters of the city code, etc. And we also know that once we do have a document that's ultimately adopted by the mayor and council, that it's not just frozen in time at that point, that there's always the potential for improving and upgrading the code as we move forward in time. And so there will be amendments likely to the document to make sure that everything is functioning well once we start using the document. So it's going to be an ambitious project to update the zoning ordinance, and we look forward to everyone's participation in it, and not the least of which is our planning commission, who were instrumental in the adoption of the comprehensive plan. And so I wanted to give some of our commissioners any time to ask questions of me, and therefore help the stakeholders understand what we're about to be undertaking here. Commissioners.
May I? Jim, thank you for that presentation. It's a great way to get us started on this project. One of the opportunities that a large citywide project like this offers is the ability to dream big. Are we confined by the current zone categories, or can new ones be developed?
I wouldn't say that we are confined by the current zoning that we have in the city. Certainly we are guided by the comprehensive plan and what those recommendations are. But if there's a better way to do our zoning than what we have in place, that's certainly within the realm of possibility. And frankly, that's why we wanted to bring on a consultant team so they could look at our zones and see if there are some improvements that can be made to them that would more closely align with the vision that the comp plan set out.
Great, thank you.
All right, again, I reiterate that this is a great comprehensive overview. I just want to go back over the community outreach portion. I think this is going to be a critical factor to consensus and best practices moving forward. I know the full strategy is yet to be determined, but it does look like we will be soliciting feedback both from individual residents and community groups at the initial phases of the project as well as moving forward, or is there only one entry point for communities to be involved?
Excellent question. I think there will be multiple points where stakeholders can be involved. Once we bring the consultant team on board, I would anticipate that there will be a kickoff meeting for stakeholders so that stakeholders and the consultant team can get acquainted, and we can all get a better understanding of kind of where they're coming from. But the way the mayor and council has drafted the charter, I think with the draft zoning ordinance coming forward early in the process so that there's not a lot of visioning early on, but that we get to a point where the public can react to the zoning ordinance draft that the consultant has come up with. So I expect that to be, perhaps 6 to 8 months into the process to give us a lot of time to review the actual code that comes forward and make sure that it's really what the city is looking for. It's kind of a double-edged sword in that we want the consultant team to come up with, best practices. We also want it to be the best practice for Rockville. And so we're trying to achieve that balance and hit both of those marks. So there'll be public comment kind of early to midway through, and then I would anticipate another round of public comment as we get to the point where there's an actual draft code that would go through the formal review process. So I really think that there's probably 3 rounds of public involvement where folks can weigh in throughout this process over the 2 years.
Why should the public care? Put yourself in the mindset of a young renter in these beautiful condos we have maybe in different parts of the city? What are just, we often focus on property owners, but think about just like a renter in anywhere in the city. How is this going to change their life, or why should they give feedback?
That's a great question also. When you think about a renter who is kind of experiencing the city, not only wherever they're renting, but they're certainly living, working, recreating, whatever they are in the city. We'd like them to stay in the city and perhaps put down roots or spend discretionary income in the city and bring others into the city. So we want that perspective from the renters to be part of the vision. We will also recognize not everyone may be able to purchase a home in the city, but certainly could rent. And so we want those folks to be part of the community and feel welcomed in the community and feel like their needs from the community can be met through zoning. It may not be an obvious thing, but I think land use has a major effect on how people live their lives, whether they realize it or not. And so that's why we really want folks to weigh in, just at a very basic level, what they expect from their community. Like, I'd like to have more retail, or I'd like to have more restaurants, or whatever it might be, to create that kind of environment that everyone can live in.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, I wanted to thank everyone for your attention on the city zoning ordinance rewrite. I'm Jim Wasilak. I'm the zoning administrator for the city, and I welcome everyone's participation in the process. We will be conducting outreach in any avenue that we possibly can, but certainly the city's website will be a good source of information at rockvillemd.gov. We will have a page set up for the entire process that you can get the latest information, and we look forward to your participation. Thank you very much.